Lens mug. Got it from my brother. Hello, Internet, and welcome to the final year-end vlog for 2016. A year that has shown us a lot of things to be happy about, and a lot of things to be sad, frustrated, and afraid about. That came out weird. Anyway, we've run the gamut of emotions throughout this very eventful year. Now, some people may argue that it's always been this tumultuous. It just so happened that a lot of the more tumultuous things that have happened in the world just got more public attention because of things like the internet and the 24-hour news cycle. But it's as I was looking for stories about 2016 that weren't all on a completely sad and sour note, it kind of made me realize something, or more or less reminded me of a realization I had, that it's something that a lot of people tend to try to either ignore or not even acknowledge is, well, a thing. And that's the need for escapist fantasy. Now, by escapist fantasy, I don't just mean sword and sorcery fantasy like Lord of the Rings or the Dragonlance series or the Wheel of Time series. It could also mean stuff like science fiction like Star Trek, Stargate, or Space Battleship Yamato. It could even be superhero stuff like Superman, Batman, Power Rangers, X-Men. That's pretty much all of that stuff kind of falls under the umbrella of escapism. I don't have to be the only one who's told you this, but let's face it, we live in a flawed and imperfect world. And there's a lot of problems that we still don't know how to solve that we're not going to be able to solve anytime soon. And that can get exhausting after a while. It's because of that we often go to things like movies, television series, comic books, regular books, radio plays, musicals, opera, even just music or a really good video game. We do all of these things just to take a break from this reality, even if only for a little while. And it's because of that desire to take a break, to escape from our reality for a little while, that makes escapism such a vital part of what allows a society to function. I mean, whether it's people telling stories around a campfire of, say, Heracles' 12 labors, of Orpheus journeying to the underworld to rescue the woman he loves, or even people like Robin Hood's taking from the rich and giving to the poor, or a future where everybody's put aside all notions of nationality for the sake of a much greater good. And one thing I've come to realize when looking at a lot of this escapist stuff, whether it's in movies, whether it's in TV shows, whether it's in comic books, regular books, so on and so forth, not only is it just people wanting to escape, sometimes the people creating this escapist fantasy can be people who are trying to show us a world they wish existed. Whether it's a fantasy world where dragons fly through the air and people can go off on great adventures and amass great wealth with very little risk, or if you're wanting to show, say, a version of our own world that is what you believe should be our world when it isn't. I mean, to use a classic example, look at Star Trek. When you look at the kind of life Gene Roddenberry had led prior to going into television, you can kind of see where he comes from in wanting to create a version of our world that has put aside all differences of race, of religion, of nationality, all in favor of basically being a better species as a whole. And that represents the kind of world some people want to see, and it's because of that presentation, especially when it's done really well like it is with stuff like Star Trek, that you can sometimes inspire people to try to make that reality, well, a reality. I mean, if you look at this, I'm sure all of you have one in some way, shape, or form, whether it's a smartphone, a flip phone, if you somehow still have one of those old bricks that were one of the early models. Well, we'd use these devices, but a lot of people using them may not realize that the person who invented cell phones that led to these fancy machines was inspired by Star Trek, by seeing Kirk using the communicator whenever he was on planet, and realized, hey, let's find a way to make that into an actual thing. And, well, now we have tiny supercomputers in the palm of our hands that we use to look at cat videos and various memes about a certain gorilla that will remain nameless. And the impact isn't limited solely to people trying to create technology based on what they've seen in these shows. It can also encourage people to be better people. I mean, look at, to use an example, and it's an example people are probably not wanting to hear right now, but look at something like A Christmas Carol, where it's a story about a man who lived most of his life as a greedy miser who basically lived alone by himself, not wanting to deal with anybody, and being inspired to try to become a better person in what short amount of time he had left because of what he saw was going to happen to his future and to his life if he continued down the path he was on. Now, imagine if someone is reading that book and seeing that story for the first time without having seen any of the other various versions. Well, imagine if someone just saw a little bit of themselves in Ebenezer Scrooge, where they see, oh, I've been doing a lot of these horrible actions. Will this mean my life could end up going down the tubes if I don't change my ways? And sometimes you even have simpler examples of people being inspired by, say, a character like Superman, not just his abilities, but for what he stood for. I mean, there was a story back at the first Salt Lake Comic Con where one of the guests was explaining how their son was obsessed with Superman, but whenever he was doing something bad, he would always ask him, okay, what would Superman do in this situation? So if he was, say, fighting with another kid or doing something bad, whenever anyone asked him what would Superman do, the kid would immediately apologize, would try to make things right. And that just shows the impact that kind of thing can have on children and as adults. And sometimes, even looking at escapism fantasy, it can also be a good way to explore the darker sides of some really heavy subjects in a context that doesn't completely traumatize you. I mean, when you look at, say, Starship Troopers, it can kind of explore the horrors of war, except instead of it being in the context of an actual war on Earth, it's in the context of soldiers having to fight against an alien race of bugs that will basically kill you when given the chance. Looking at stuff like Ender's Game, and yes, I know about the controversial opinions of Orson Scott Card, but let me make my example, please. When you're looking at something like Ender's Game and kind of how people have tried to make war as a video game and trying to basically get younger and younger kids to basically become the soldiers and commanding officers of the future. You can even see that taken to another logical extreme with stuff like Metal Gear Solid 2, Sons of Liberty, and how you can easily try to manipulate a single person if you make them believe enough in the scenario they're in to basically make them do absolutely horrible things because in their mind they think they're doing something right. And that's especially what you get to see with a character like Raiden, who grew up as a child soldier in Liberia and was then saved by Solidus, but then, that game is way too complex. I would just recommend, if you get the chance, play Metal Gear Solid 2, because it's a good game that also explores and plays around with a lot of darker themes in an escapist context. And the thing is, using escapism to explore a lot of these darker themes and ideas that we're not quite sure how to internalize yet is something that we've always been able to do. I mean, when you look at how certain kids play out scenarios using their toys to kind of come to terms with a much larger thing they're having a hard time accepting. I mean, I have an example in my own personal life where I did that very thing, except this time it was as a teenager, and instead of using toys, it was using writing. I've mentioned in the past how I don't really look back on a lot of my high school experiences with a lot of fondness, and the reason for it is that there was a time in my life where my emotions and my brain were just straight up put through the ringer. I mean, if you've seen Me and Earl and the Dying Girl, you probably remember the line that girls will basically mess you up, and that is kind of what happened, although it's kind of unfair to say that it was strictly a girl that did it. It's more everything surrounding it. Anyway, emotionally, mentally, I was not in a very good place because I was made to feel a lot of emotions that prior to that point I hadn't really felt before, and it kind of showed me a darker side of myself that terrified me. It kind of made my brain go to some really dark, really messed up places when I was just thinking about it on my own, that in hindsight I realized, wow, it's a miracle I didn't become some weird serial killer or something. And so what I ended up doing, and granted it was under the guise of an experiment, where I basically wrote a series of short stories using the likenesses of people in my school, like naming them by name, matching their physical descriptions to how they actually dressed, although I didn't really get any of their personalities right. But I basically wrote a bunch of actual people into a fantasy story that was basically just really, really bad Final Fantasy fan fiction. But it was in hindsight when I was actually revisiting those stories recently where I realized what I was doing. I was writing those stories to try to make sense of what I just went through emotionally. I mean, when I look at the way I wrote the quote-unquote idealized version of myself, I use that term very loosely, because again, dark weeaboo days. But anyway, a lot of the lines of dialogue I had the various characters in these stories saying, in hindsight I realized was basically my subconscious giving my conscious mind a strict talking to about what just happened and why I need to get to snap out of my funk. And so whether it's using escapism to explore personal emotions that you're trying to come to terms with, or exploring like darker themes that you see in your world around you, it plays a vital role in allowing a society to run, because it allows us to come to terms with a lot of really dark and not really pleasant things that our world can offer us. And that is one of the main reasons why escapism is so important. Not only does it allow us to create a world that we wish existed, but it also allows us to come to terms with some of the darker aspects of our world that, if we went into the actual context, just wouldn't really communicate. You wouldn't get the message across because people would be too off put, as well as being kind of in that sense of, oh, well, I don't have to worry about such and such because it's not happening to me, clearly. That is why escapism is so important. And that is why it's an important source of hope that I think a lot of people are going to be looking towards in going into 2017 and many, many years, many centuries, many eons into the future. The shape may change, but its purpose stays the same: to try to make sense of the world we live in and to hopefully inspire us to make it much better. On that note, rather than flip a middle finger to 2016, even though there are many people in this world rightly justified to do so, let us instead raise a glass to 2016, a year that was exciting, eventful, flawed, terrifying, and will hopefully inspire us to make the next year and years after it that much better. Happy New Year, everybody.